With the 2024-2025 NHL season underway, Hunter Hodies and I are here to break down top 10s entering the NHL season.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On NHL. My name is Nick Zararis. I'm the host of Locked On Oilers. That is Hunter Hodies, one of the hosts of Locked On Penguins. We want to thank everyone who's making Locked On NHL their first listen of the day. Locked On NHL, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, Hunter, we have a lot to get through today, so I'm going to start by framing this conversation very straightforwardly so our listeners know where we're going today. We are talking about the top 10-ish. We're going to give a few honorable mentions in this first segment. Teams, their probabilities, their chances, how strongly we feel they are capable of winning a Stanley Cup. This is not regular season based. This is not who's going to win the most games, President's Trophy. That's a different conversation. The tenor and the framing of this conversation on today's show is most likely to win the Stanley Cup. So at the outset, our first segment here, we're going to start with teams that are right around that periphery, somewhere between 10 and say 13 or 14. We'll give those honorable mentions like we said. We'll move along to that middle class of teams where they probably need a deadline addition or two, or they need something to break right for them. And then we're going to conclude with our best contenders, the teams we feel really strongly have a good chance. So in this conversation, in this opening segment, I think it's important to note that the teams we're about to talk about are still pretty good. You know, these are all playoff teams. These are all teams that probably can win a round, maybe even two. But beyond that, it feels a bit out of their means. So when I talk like that, what teams come to mind for you when we talk in that domain?
So teams that can win a round or two, at least for me.
Yeah.
Maybe a team like, for example, the Toronto Maple Leafs. I don't have them in my top tier overall, but I still struggle to see them, beating a team like the Panthers pretty deep in the playoffs, for example. I definitely think the Leafs are, again, they're contending, but I still need to see it from them in the playoffs before, again, I pick them to go really deep overall. I kind of also see the Bruins in there as well. I think they're good to win a round or two. I don't see them as a bona fide full-on contender like some of these other teams like Edmonton, Florida, the Rangers, etc. So those are two teams that definitely come to mind, at least for me. And I know some people will get on me for this. I kind of see Nashville in there as well. I'm high on Nashville this year. Don't get me wrong. I see them as a bona fide playoff team, a team that can finish top three in the Central. I just don't know if they will have the horses to beat a team like Dallas in a 7-game series, if Colorado as well, especially if Colorado gets healthier throughout the season and they potentially add more at the deadline. I see those two teams still as a step ahead of Nashville. It's not by a lot. Don't get me wrong. I think Nashville would have a good shot against those two teams, but I still think they're a bit step below both of them, at least right now. So those are three teams that definitely come to mind for me. And if we're talking, as well, the Tampa Bay Lightning, I think they can definitely get in the playoffs, make a little bit of noise, but I don't see them going deep or anything like that. And also Carolina is in there as well for me, Nick.
All right, so I'm going to pick off of what you said because I agree with you for the most part for the teams you mentioned there. Carolina, I think, is the epitome of really good regular season team, but the way they play, their style, their high-end talent, it's not very conducive to playoff success. We have seen when they have run up against teams that have better high-end players, in spite of the fact that Carolina often controls the flow of play, has more possession, they're not able to do enough with it, whether it's the two series against the Rangers, against the Bruins a couple years ago. When the other team has better high-end players, Carolina's possession doesn't particularly matter for them. Toronto, as you alluded to, I don't trust their defense. And like we talked about a few weeks ago when we were previewing the Atlantic Division, you came into the season with two goalies with no real track record of being bell cow starters, and Will started the season on injured reserve. So at that point, you're really putting a lot on a defense that's not that good to begin with. Then we get to Nashville, who I like the pieces. I want to see it come together for them. It probably takes a little while for them to get going. Saw today, Zararis is starting the season on injured reserve. They're going to go with Scott Wedgwood tonight against Dallas, against his former club. Nashville's a team that has enough talent where I think if they get hot for a week, they probably could beat anyone in the entire league in a playoff series, because when you have a Forsberg and a Stamkos and a Marchessault and a Yossi and a Saros, I mean, that's really good. I mean, that's one of the best collections of talent in the entire NHL as far as star power. You know, they had pretty good underlying results through their middle six last year with some lower caliber, or I shouldn't say that, I should say non-name brand players. And then the other team I wanted to throw in here in this honorable mention section, I would also like throw in the Lightning. Like you said, the depth just isn't there for me. As much as I like the individuals, especially at the top end of that lineup, once you get past that second line, it really gets dire. And look, they've manufactured a lot out of Brandon Hagel. I never thought Brandon Hagel would be a 65, 70 point forward, but Tampa Bay was able to identify that and bring that to life. I think I'm very curious to see how that defense ends up shaking out with 35-year-old Ryan McDonough playing heavy minutes. I don't know how sustainable that is. We talked a lot during their preview when we did the Atlantic Division about how good Andrei Vasilevsky can be the further removed he gets from back surgery. I think you saw their limitations last season where they had the best power play in the entire NHL in the regular season. And then they got to that first round series against Florida. And other than games 1 and game 4, they didn't have a chance in any of those games. Game 1, they had a good look at the end of the game to tie it and force it to overtime. Stamkos missed an open net. And then game 4, they won to force it game 5. But Florida thoroughly outclassed them with a possession-based approach and really wore them down. And then as far as the Bruins don't score enough. This isn't a secret. They're a great defensive team. They have a good goalie in Jeremy Swayman, who in theory should be ready to go relatively soon, ramping back up to get back into hockey. I know he was doing hockey activities prior to agreeing to his contract extension, but until they get going, I'm a little skeptical. I want to see how Lindholm fits in, how they choose to deploy him, Pasternak, Marchand, if they want to keep them all together, if they want to split them up. And then it's been their issue, you know, like what we said with Carolina before about just not having enough offense in the playoffs. That's been Boston's problem. You know, they played Florida reasonably well last year in that first round series. They just didn't score enough to keep that series going long enough. And then the one last team I would consider for this tier, I go back and forth between putting the Devils here or in the next tier up. I want to see the Devils put it together. You know, they started out 2-0. They beat the Sabres twice over in Prague. They're playing the Leafs tonight, who they, like I said before, they're starting a backup goalie, so that bodes well. I was worried about how good of a start they'd get off to with so many new moving pieces. You know, you're talking about 3 new defensemen, a new head coach. That's a lot of turnover in a short period of time, not to mention how well Jacob Markstrom gets acclimated to a new environment. So this is probably the thickest group in this tier, in this list we're going to talk about today, because as we progress, it's going to get smaller because frankly, there's a lot of mediocrity in the NHL, Hunter. I'm going to throw it back to you here, but there's a lot of mediocre teams who are they're fine. They can win a round or two, but for the most part, we've got a very refined small class of contenders.
Yeah, I feel like there's only about, I would say, 6 potentially true Stanley Cup contenders. And we'll get into that a little bit later on in the show. The rest of the teams are either playoff teams that can win a round or two, mediocre teams who are going to be in the race, and then just flat out bad teams overall. So I agree. There's really only a select amount of contenders. I agree with you about the Devils, but I personally have the Devils a bit higher up just because I liked how they started the season. I think when healthy, this team is a contender. I feel like they have the goalie now that could potentially put them over the top. Even with Sheldon Keefe as head coach, and I think he's fine, I still think that this team is going to be a top 3 team in the Metro. I had them second place in the division, but we'll have to see. But yeah, I think you said it best with those teams. They're a bit step below a team like, you know, for example, for me, Colorado, Florida, Edmonton. Those are the contenders that I can see, you know, winning 3 rounds, getting to the final, winning the final, all that stuff. I think for these other teams that we just mentioned, stuff would have to go right for them. They're going to have to get a bit lucky because remember, a little bit of the Stanley Cup playoffs is luck, people. I mean, you do need a little bit of luck to go your way if you want to win a championship. And that's just not in the Stanley Cup playoffs. That's in the NFL, that's Major League Baseball, and that's the NBA. I feel like people downplay that quite a bit. And to your point about Boston, I mean, Jeremy Swayman did everything he could in that series last year. I thought he was tremendous against the Panthers, but they just didn't get the scoring. and the Panthers were able to do a great job defending against the Bruins' top guys. And I feel like at the end of the day, that was the main difference. So again, I think for the teams that we mentioned, something is going to have to break for those teams to go a bit deeper. But these are still very good teams overall, and they should make the playoffs.
Agreed. And we are going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On NHL. When we come back, we are going to start talking about some of the more serious contenders. You have a good idea of who's in this group. You'll see after this break. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You can get started with $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet tonight on Thursday Night Football. Good old school NFC West, 49ers going to San Francisco, 49ers 3.5-point road favorites. My personal favorite game of the weekend, Kyler Murray and the Cardinals going up to Lambeau to take on the Packers. The Cardinals 4.5-point road underdogs. And then Sunday Night Football, Joe Burrow and the Bengals going to New York to take on the Giants. The Giants 3.5-point home underdogs. And if you want to get in on the action to spice up your NFL Sunday, go check out FanDuel.com to get started. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out with us on this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL, where Hunter, Hodies, and I are working our way through the top 10-ish contenders to win the Stanley Cup this season. I'm going to start this segment and then give you some time. I only have 3 teams in this group because I feel they're probably closer to one or the other, but I didn't feel particularly confident. In this group, I have the Devils, I have Vegas, and I have Florida. And actually, you know what? And I'll throw Colorado in here as well. Florida, I'll start out real quickly. It's just really hard to go back to back. That's really the only knock in the logic I have for being anti-Florida, being in the first tier with the contenders. I want to see how they play over the course of the season. Going to the Cup final 2 years in a row, and then to go a third straight year. That really doesn't happen. I know Tampa Bay did that in relatively recent history, but Tampa Bay had a lot of extenuating circumstances that facilitated them getting there. The bubble playoffs, the 56-game season, having $100 million worth of roster players because they were able to LTIR guys. So that's why I'm putting Florida here. The Devils, like I said at the end of the last segment, I need to see it come together. They have the potential to be very good. They came out of the gate looking pretty well against the Sabres with no Luke Hughes, who's still probably a few weeks away from returning. Seamus Casey, a very interesting prospect, right-handed, a little undersized. So there were questions about his NHL viability as a defenseman being only 5'10", 5'11". I have Colorado here because their high-end talent is incredible, but their depth is non-existent. We know they're going to have to make moves during the course of the season to improve. Vegas, they need to stay healthy. If they don't stay healthy, they're going to miss the playoffs. You know, we saw this 3 years ago. The first year Eichel got traded there, they all got hurt and they missed the playoffs. When you are this fragile and this dependent on a few guys to make stuff happen for you, you can't afford to lose any of those guys. Stone, Eichel, Pietrangelo. I'm very excited to see what Noah Hannafin does first full season on a team that has some talent that's not asking him to carry a ridiculous workload. And then as far as Vegas, the one last point I want to get in before I throw it over to you, it feels like they probably need a little bit of a refinement on their roster. They probably need a little bit more depth. They are probably a little bit too top heavy. You know, they won their Stanley Cup, so like they went out and paid people, paying Barbashev, paying Aiden Hill. I get it. But to maintain the window of competitiveness and what separated them from, say, Toronto or the Rangers was the fact that they had quality depth. You know, they had guys like Barbashev, they had guys like Marchessault, Wild Bill. They had enough depth to be able to sustain having such high-end expensive guys. But when you win, you get looted for your good players. And that's what's happened to Vegas over the last few seasons.
I don't disagree, though. I still think their high-end talent puts them, at least for me, in the contender tier just because, again, if these guys are healthy, they're going to be a very tough out in the playoffs like they have been in the last several years. I kind of just have one main tier up next, and these are who I feel like are the top tier contenders for this year. It's about 6 to 7 to 8 teams deep, and then the rest of the teams, again, I kind of see as just, you know, teams that can win around and teams that just can get into the playoffs, for example. So for this tier, I do have the Florida Panthers in there. I understand what your reservations about it just because it's so hard to go back to back, and they did lose a couple of pieces, but man, they looked great on opening day against the Bruins. And this team is still very deep. Kachuk had another great game. Bennett started the season really well. This is still going to be a very dangerous team. And if they especially get great goaltending from Sergei Bobrovsky, I still think this is a team that can go pretty deep in the playoffs, even though they've gone deep 2 years in a row. I know that's a lot of hockey, but I still have them very much in contender tier. The Edmonton Oilers, obviously at the top. I actually picked them on Locked On Penguins with my co-host Patrick Amp. I have them winning the cup this year. I really feel like this is the year they do it. I understand how badly they got blown out the other night by the Winnipeg Jets, and Skinner did not play well, but they're going to bounce back. This is the Oilers, people. McDavid, Draisaitl, and company are going to have a great year. This is a team that can go very, very deep, and they made some really good moves at forward over the summer to shore up their depth. The Dallas Stars, this is still very much a contender. I understand they've been coming up short, but I feel like they have the deepest forward group in the league overall. Defensively, they're very sound. If Ottinger heats up, look out. This is still very much a contender in my eyes. After that, you have the Rangers, and I will put the Devils in there as well. If the Devils are healthy, this is a top-tier Stanley Cup contender. I think they have what it takes to go deep if they're healthy. They finally have the goalie. I discussed them a little bit ago. The Rangers, you saw that on display on Wednesday against the Penguins. This is a top-tier contender, and this is probably the last year for this core. They have a lot of tough decisions coming. They have a lot of RFAs. They have some UFAs next year. Obviously, they have to deal with Shesterkin, who, according to Kevin Weeks, declined an 8 times 11 contract. In other words, 8 years, $88 million overall. I'm sure he's looking for 12 to $12.5 million. And you know what? He deserves it. He's the best goaltender in the league. He deserves to be fairly compensated. I know some Rangers fans, Nick, were mad about that on Twitter. Don't really know why. When you have a goalie like that, you got to pay him. So still, that's a top tier contender for me, but I still feel like they could use another forward in that lineup. And then I'm going to throw Vancouver in there and Colorado. I do think those are also top tier contenders. Yeah, I know Vancouver lost on Wednesday against the Flames and they blew a 3-goal lead. By the way,
very fun game. Very fun
game to watch. Quinn Hughes saving the empty net goal, going down. JT Miller gets the tying goal to send it to overtime. That was just beautiful hockey on day 2 of the NHL season. I still think this is a top tier contender, especially if they're able to get Demko back at some point. He's able to figure out his health. And then Colorado, I think they're going to make some moves at the deadline. You saw, again, Nick, Ranson and McKinnon last night. They were already deadly to start this season. Yeah, I know they played Vegas, and that's a very tough team to play against, but you saw how great their high-end talent was, at least at times on display. And I feel like that's going to continue throughout the season. So those I feel like are my top tier contenders. Again, 6 to 8 strong teams. After that, it's teams where I feel like they could only win a round or two. But these 6 to 8 teams that I just mentioned, I can easily see winning 3 rounds, winning the Stanley Cup, all that good stuff.
Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to take our second and final break of today's show. And when we come back, Hunter and I are going to dive deeper into the teams he was talking about, because those are the teams that I haven't mentioned yet are the teams that I have in that upper tier. So when we come back, we're going to dive into those teams each a little bit, coming up after this break. If you are as excited about hockey season as I am, and you want to get to a game, no matter who your favorite team is, go check out Gametime with some of the best features in the ticket buying experience. My personal favorite, the panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. If you're going to a hockey game, you want to know if you got to look for the red light or if you're going to see that puck go in behind the goalie before you jump out of your seat and go absolutely nuts. When you go to Gametime, the seat view, the lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. And Gametime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. All right, Hunter, let's go into this team by team. So I'm just going to ask you one question about each of these teams, and we'll go from there. So for Vancouver, Other than the goaltending, do you have any concerns about the Canucks?
No, I really don't. I think this is a great team up and down forward wise. Defensively, I mean, I guess they could use an upgrade or two there, obviously, but I still feel like they're good enough to get by and go on deep runs. The main question for me, though, is goaltending.
Yes, because if Thatcher Demko's healthy, he's one of the 5-ish best goalies in the world, and you drop that behind what's a really good offensive team, and you run a version of what the Rangers do, where you trade chances and you let your high-end players win you the game, because when you have JT Miller, Quinn Hughes, Elias Pettersson, Brock Besser, you can really do a lot, and that opens up doors for you. All right, as far as the Dallas Stars, do you think their high-end talent is good enough to go head-to-head with Edmonton, with Vegas, with Colorado? Because that's been the issue for Dallas. You know, they've run into teams where the other team's best players are just better, and as deep as the Stars are, they haven't been able to overcome those odds.
Right. That's the main question. I agree with you. I do think, even though I'm very bullish on the Stars this year, the main thing has been, can their high-end talent outproduce a Connor McDavid, a Leon Draisaitl, a Nathan McKinnon, a Mikko Rantanen and that stuff? And even if they can't, I feel like if they're able to somehow, do like a draw against them and let their depth kind of outshine those other teams' depths, I feel like they can win the series. It's just that the Stars have not been able to even get a draw against those other teams with high-end talent, Nick. That's where I feel like they've kind of failed in these series, because they've let McDavid and Draisaitl just take over these series. And if you want to beat a team like Edmonton, you obviously you can't do that. So I think if they're able to get a draw against some of these better players, and don't get me wrong, I love Jason Robertson, I love Wyatt Johnston, Rupe Hintz, et cetera, Heiskanen, of course, but they need to be able to draw against some of these other top teams.
For sure. Speaking of Edmonton, do you think Edmonton has gone too offense heavy, that they prioritize trying to score more at the expense of improving their defense? Because they did spend a lot on forwards. They cut costs on the back end, and they have two relatively unproven guys that they're asking to play a lot and difficult minutes.
See, I feel like they needed to address the forward depth, because even last year, I didn't really like their bottom six as much. You addressed it a little bit over the offseason here, but there is going to come a time where you have to address your defense a little bit. And I do think the Oilers front office will figure that out as the trade deadline gets closer in early March. I do think there'll be a team that's in on some of the big defensemen that hit the market. Maybe someone like, for example, Nick, a Marcus Pettersson from the Penguins. If the Penguins are out of it by the deadline like they were at the time last year, I could see the Oilers being one of the teams that's interested in Pettersson, because they could definitely use a defenseman like him on the second pairing, heck, even the top pairing. He's good enough to play on either pairing. Could see them going after him. I think if I wanted to say one more question, it's just, can Stuart Skinner be consistent? Wasn't good against the Jets on opening night. How consistent can he be? But still, I picked them to win the Stanley Cup. I think this is, arguably the best team in the league heading into the season. So there's still some questions, of course, but I still have them as the top team.
Okay. For the Rangers, I know when we had talked about the Metro last week, you had said your concerns were, can their high-end players find ways to translate their game to the postseason? Other than that, any real serious concerns in terms of the way they've constructed their roster? Because obviously, they played really well last night against Pittsburgh, but one game. I personally feel the thing the Rangers have that's really going to work for them, and this is a massive knock on wood, so if you hear me on my desk right now, if Hedl's healthy, that's a really good third line. That's really something the Rangers haven't had at the start of a season. That's usually had to be a deadline thing. But do you feel the Rangers have addressed their at least scoring issues?
I think they're a bit deeper this year compared to last year. I still feel like they could use another forward for the bottom six, in my opinion, another difference maker down there. I think the top six is fine. If you maybe want to upgrade over someone like Riley Smith, you can maybe do that as well. But this is probably as good as they're going to be, forward wise heading into the playoffs. If they want to make a move or two, which I think they should, they could do that. But as of right now, it's as good as it can be. Defensively, they could have changed things up over the offseason. They decided not to. I still am curious to see how their 5-on-5 play looks throughout the rest of the season. It was very good against the Penguins on Wednesday, but how does that continue for the next 81 games, considering their 5-on-5 numbers these last few years have been fine, Nick, but it's not, top tier like some of these other contenders overall.
Do you think the Devils have enough experience to be serious Stanley Cup contenders? Because we talk about that a lot, that part of that process of becoming a real Stanley Cup contender is making the playoffs, 4, 5, 6, 7 times before you eventually break through. They have one playoff appearance since they've drafted Jack Hughes. And yeah, they played well against the Rangers, but one real good postseason series of experience. I do think that is, I don't want to say disqualifying, but it definitely gives me more pause about considering them as a contender to the same degree as maybe the Rangers, Edmonton, Dallas, Vancouver, etc.
I think with New Jersey, that experience will definitely help them this year. They showed that they can play playoff hockey against a team that had been making the playoffs, a little bit before them overall. And I felt like the Devils, they were a bit nervous to start that series. You saw it those first couple of games, but then they eased their way into it. They got those 2 games out of the way, and then they started playing like they had been playing throughout the rest of that regular season. And sure, it didn't work out in the next round, but I feel like that experience, at least for me, could help them this year, especially if this team is healthy, because, everyone does stay healthy. Hamilton plays the full season. Jack Hughes doesn't get hurt. Nico Hischier doesn't get hurt. This team will be top 3 in the Metro, and they will be a serious threat to win the Cup. And I do think Tom Fitzgerald will be able to help this team around the deadline, maybe add another forward, maybe add another defenseman, something like that. They already have addressed the goalie, but, they could definitely use a little bit more experience. But in my opinion, personally, I think that playoff series against the Rangers and just the playoffs in general a couple years ago will only help that young core. If they had not made the playoffs yet, with this young core, I would be a little bit more concerned, but they've had a taste of it. They know how it works. Now it's all about putting everything together and, doing this for more than just one round.
As far as Colorado, are they asking too much of their best players? Because that's my concern. I really do worry that McKinnon's a freak. He doesn't mind playing 26 minutes a night as a center, but it's a long season to be asking him, Makar, Rantanen to just carry the load that they're going to be asked to this season.
Right. I think it's very fair. I do think they're asking probably a little bit too much right now, but we still have to see the health of Gabe Landeskog at this point. We also, I think at least, the Colorado front office is one of the best front offices in the league. Joe Sakic and Chris McFarland, they are very good at knowing what to add to this team around the deadline. I'm sure that's going to be no different this time around. I'm sure they're going to add at the deadline. I know they sometimes have a little bit of trouble with their salary cap situation, but they're always so great at figuring that out. Makar can play however long he wants. Same with Rantanen, same with McKinnon. Some of their depth does scare me a little bit, but I feel like they're going to be able to get by for most of the season relying on those guys before they can get, a little bit more reinforcements by the time the deadline rolls around, by the time the playoffs roll around. I don't think you're going to see these guys be gassed per se, but I definitely worry a little bit because I don't want them to be fully, just overworked. Again, I don't think that's going to happen, but I do think the question you raise is very fair.
All right. The last question I have of this tier that we're talking about of these teams. Is it too much hockey? Have the Panthers played too much hockey over the last 3 seasons to be a contender? And look, that's not a comment on the quality of their team. They're very talented. I think I'm approaching my perspective of the Panthers in particular from more of a strategy standpoint, where like if I'm trying to pick the team that wins the Stanley Cup, what typically does that team look like? What does their previous seasons look like? And just, it's a lot of games. It is a lot of games to play 82 regular season games and 4 postseason series 2 years in a row. And look, I expect the Panthers to win 45, 50 games this year. I think they're going to win the Atlantic. I think there's a reasonable chance they're the best team in the entire East. I just think the miles catch up with you eventually.
Right. And you saw that with Tampa Bay, Nick. They went to 3 straight Stanley Cup finals. And by the time they got to the 3rd one, you could tell they were gassed. Yeah. They got obliterated in that series. It looked like they had nothing left. And I think with the Panthers, they're going to win 45, 50 games. They're a bona fide contender. It wouldn't surprise me if they got back to the final, considering, the conference overall. And I feel like the Panthers still right now are the best team in the conference, but will they be able to beat the best team out of the West? Will they be able to beat Edmonton, if, for example, if Edmonton gets back there again a second year in a row? Right now, if I had to pick, I think I would go with Edmonton to beat Florida in a final, just considering how many games Florida has played. So, yeah, I do think right now it is a lot of games, especially if they do win 45-50, especially if they do win 3 long, grueling playoff series. For example, if those 3 series before they get to the final are grueling, I'm going to be afraid that they might not have anything left in the Stanley Cup final, just like how Tampa Bay did a few years ago. So, yeah, I do. I think it's a lot of hockey, but hey, who knows? Who's to say they won't go back to back? But in my opinion, I definitely think you're asking a lot, man. You really are.
Okay, Hunter, last question. It is October 10th. It is 1:15 Eastern Standard Time. I want your Stanley Cup final matchup. I'm not asking you who's going to win. I'm asking you what 2 teams will be playing for the Stanley Cup in June.
You know what? I might sound insanely boring here. Give me Edmonton versus, give me a rematch, man. Honestly, just give me a rematch. That final last year was so great. Give me a rematch of those 2 teams, and I'll say it, Edmonton takes it this year. I think those 2 teams right now, at least in my opinion, are still the best teams in the conference, at least heading into the season. Give me a rematch. I know it's going to be boring to everyone listening to or watching this. You can leave a comment flaming me if you want, but that's how I see it. If I'm wrong, it won't be the first time. It definitely won't be the last time, people.
Yeah, I'm not much more exciting. Like, if you wanted my, exciting final, I would say something like Vancouver and the Rangers, maybe. But, I feel hard-pressed to pick anyone other than Florida to come out of the East just because the way they play is so conducive to the playoffs. And nobody else in the East plays that way.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Nobody else plays that heavy possession cycle style to the degree of success that Florida has over the last handful of seasons in the East. And it's why they wear away at teams like the Rangers, at Carolina, Tampa Bay, etc. It's chalky, but I would say something along the lines of Florida-Dallas, probably, if I had to pick who was the Cup final right now. But that's why they're going to play the games over the next 6.5 months. Hunter and I will talk to you guys next week. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, let us know your Stanley Cup final matchup prediction. Talk to you guys real soon.